exposed and on display. I look up to see you writing in the sand. You've loved every sin away. I hear the sound of guilty stones fall from their hands. I am aware of what they've said of me. Oh, I don't care, I need you. Sing it out. Say I'd rather be in a million pieces at your feet than a million miles away from you. Oh, I'm staying right here. Yeah, I'd rather be in a million pieces at your feet than a million miles away from you. Torn and tattered, bruised and battered, this is where the healing begins. Burdened, heavy, desperate, empty, this is where the healing begins. Torn and tattered, bruised and battered, this is where the healing begins. Burdened, heavy, desperate, empty, this is where the healing begins. Oh, torn and tattered, bruised and battered, this is where the healing begins. Burdened, heavy, desperate, empty, this is where the healing begins. Oh, torn and tattered, bruised and battered, this is where the healing begins. Burdened, heavy, desperate, empty, this is where the healing begins. Come on, this is where the healing begins. This is where the healing begins. Oh, this is where the healing begins. Oh, this is where the healing begins. Right here, this is where the healing begins. This is where the healing begins. Yeah, this is where the healing begins. Oh,
Zach is working his magic back there. So, good afternoon, everyone. How are y'all today? Can y'all hear me? Okay, good. Well, I heard that that Lily Holmes made an announcement at the beginning today that you all can write notes to our cross-cultural workers. Y'all see that on your tables. There's even a QR code if you want to do it electronically. And for those of you that are online, that are members of our church that would like to do that, we're going to make that available for you so we can send notes of encouragement to our workers. This is Missions Month, and so yeah, we would love for you to do that. Some of you may not have been here Wednesday or Sunday night, but we had a worship service Sunday night, and when you make your way into the Charlie Hamill Welcome Center, if you happen to go that way, you're going to notice there's a display in the kind of in the center of the Charlie Hamill Welcome Center, and it has ping pong balls in it. And on the side of it, it has little baskets with other ping pong balls, and there are white ones and pink ones and eventually green ones. And what we're asking people to do is to ask the Lord to put somebody on your heart that you may feel led to share the Lord with, or at least invite them to be a part of our life as a church family, and you'd just like to pray over them. Just put their initials on one of those white ping pong balls and drop it in the slot. And then whenever you actually begin to have conversations with them, you can put their initials on them and put a pink ping pong ball in the container. And then once you either ultimately share the gospel with them or truly invite them to be a part of a Bible study or visit with you in your home, or you take kind of a much more substantial step, or maybe they come to know Christ, we want you to put initials on a green ping pong ball and put it in there. So we would love to see that display fill up with white, pink, and green ping pong balls over the course of Missions Month. So I'll mention that again Sunday morning. So with that said, let's continue our journey on our study of Exodus. And we are in Exodus 34, verse 10. And we actually have 3 lessons left before we take a break for the holidays. One today, one next week, where we'll look at the construction of the tabernacle. And then the final Wednesday night, the dedication of the tabernacle. Just to remind you of where we are in the story right now, this section of material actually begins back in Exodus 25, and it is about the instructions that God gives to Moses about the tabernacle, and really about the worship life of Israel. They're going to be covenant people, and God is going to have expectations for them when it comes to worship Him and live out that covenant in relationship with Him. Y'all remember there's a little interlude in the middle of these 2 sections where Israel builds a golden calf and breaks the covenant relationship with God, or at least they fail on their part of the covenant, if you will. And so God has responded to that. He has spoken to them. He has, we talked about that last week. He's going to invite Israel to continue to be His people, but they're going to need to restore the covenant. So that's where we are today. So let's look at Exodus 34:10. It's the restoration of the covenant. These 2 verses are where we kind of transition in the story. So if you look at verse 10, then the Lord said, I'm making a covenant with you. Now, He's already done this. This is just the restoration of what's been broken because of Israel's unfaithfulness. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you today, and I will drive out before you. And then He lists all these pagan peoples who will be living in Canaan. So the turn in the story here is God forgiving Israel, hearing the prayers of Moses, and restoring His covenant relationship with His people. And He lets Moses know that this is His intention. He also, though, if you'll notice, He asks them to be willing to obey Him, because that's going to be the challenge for Israel, to live in faithful relationship with God. But God is going to call Israel to a life of obedience in His presence. And He will do more than they can ever do for themselves. He tells them, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to give you the ability to take over the promised land once you arrive. So with that said, he then outlines what he is going to ask from Israel. And that's where this section of what I just have called requirements in your outline begins. It starts in verse 12. He says, first of all, there's got to be purity in worship. That is going to be a challenge for Israel, particularly before the exile. You know, you and I have just been studying the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the story of Israel returning after the exile. When they return after the exile, this won't be as big of a problem. But for some reason, in all the intervening years, this is going to be a challenge to them. And so if you look at verse 12, he says to them, be careful about relationships. Here's what I want you to do in verse 13. When you get into the promised land, break down the altars. In other words, when you make your way through, here's what you're going to discover. There are going to be all kinds of places of worship scattered all over the promised land. Don't be tempted to use them at all. Don't make sacrifices to me on any of those altars. The Baal worshipers often would put these fertility poles adjacent to their altars, kind of symbolic of trees, if you will, of fruitfulness and all that. And he says, I want you to get rid of all of that. Verse 14, don't worship any other god because I'm jealous. If you want to refer to me, I'm the Lord, but I'm also jealous. I'm a jealous God. And so he says, be careful when you make your way into the promised land. You've got to worship me in purity. Even in verse 25, he says, don't offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. Don't let the sacrifice from the Passover festival remain until morning. And then he repeats this. This is mentioned 3 times in the book of the law. Don't cook a young goat in its mother's milk. It's kind of an interesting little requirement. And the reason for that is it's already appeared once in the book of Exodus back in earlier in chapter 23. It'll appear again in Deuteronomy 14. And when you study pagan people in the ancient world, they had all kinds of rituals that they thought were somewhat magical. This was one of them. They would use the mother's milk of a goat in all kinds of ceremonies. The idea being that it was fertile, it's what would nurture a young goat. And so they had all these magic rituals that were associated with boiling a young goat in its mother's milk, believing that that would bless the rest of the herd or the flock, and that somehow these pagan gods would respond to it. So in other words, Israel is going to walk into a land where all kinds of pagan rituals are going to be in front of them, and the pagan people believe these things actually work. So Israel is going to be tempted to participate in some of them, so God keeps spelling out very specific things that you just can't do. Does that make sense? You're not going to engage. This isn't magic. That's not what this is. You don't do all this as if something magical is going to occur just because you've done the ritual. That's not how it's going to work with God. So there's got to be purity in worship. There has to be purity in relationships. You've got to be careful who you make treaties with. If you look at verse 15, when you get there, the Lord says, I don't want you to engage with them in these official relationships. He even says, be careful. I don't want you to intermarry with them. And y'all, this is not really an ethnic concern. This is a religious concern. And that's exactly what he says here. He says the temptation you're going to have is to engage in relationships, familial relationships among these pagans. And when you do that, then your kids are going to be confused, and they're going to have the temptation to join the pagan rituals of their spouses. And they're going to be just as connected to their families as they are your family. Does that make sense? So he just says, just don't do it. This is not an ethnic thing. This is actually a religious purity issue for God. And again, it's going to be an issue for Israel. They're going to struggle with this. And it's going to be one of those things that will challenge them before this story is over. And then the whole idea of purity in worship is mentioned again in verse 17, don't make any idols. And then the Lord says, now, I want you to build your calendar around me and what I've done for you. I want you to remind yourself annually in these festivals that I'm your God, that I'm the one who has rescued you and redeemed you, and I'm the one who provides for you and cares for you. So your calendar is going to be built around these festivals. And so he outlines these 3 festivals to make sure they understand they've got to continue to celebrate them. So verse 18, the festival of the unleavened bread, which again in their homes they would celebrate the feast of the Passover. And he challenges them to remember to do that. If you look at verse 22, the festival of the weeks and the festival of the ingathering, he says, I want you to celebrate these all year. Look at verse 23, 3 times a year. And eventually what's going to happen is once they settle in the Promised Land and Jerusalem will become their capital, they're going to, a Jewish male is going to be required to make a trip to Jerusalem to engage in these 3 festivals at least one time in their lifetime. If they live close enough, they come every year. And so the Lord is challenging Israel to, on an annual basis, acknowledge the fact that He is their God, and they're building their celebrations around Him rather than building their celebrations around themselves. So, ancient people celebrated all kinds of things. There are all kinds of festivals. So sometimes people get a little confused by that because it makes them a little nervous that all these pagan people had celebrations too. Well, they did. But God says the ones that I want you to observe are the ones that are built around me and my relationship with you and my provision for you. So you're going to build all of this that is going to result out of and emerge from your relationship with me. Then he says, every time life appears in your camp, the firstborn is always going to be a reminder that I'm the author of life, and that firstborn always belongs to me. It's just something that's going to be woven into their theology. And so they're going to have to make sacrifices to redeem that firstborn back to themselves. Again, it's just a reminder that God's the author of life and that firstborn belongs to Him. So the firstborn's got to be redeemed. And once again, it's just a way to tangibly acknowledge their relationship with God in every arena of their life. So what the Lord is laying out for these people is an inability to compartmentalize their lives away from Him. Pretty much everything about them is going to be connected to Him. So He is going to be a part of their everyday personal lives. And just to reiterate that, honor the Sabbath. Every week, you're going to set aside a day where you honor me. And he says, even when you're in the busiest season of your life as a farmer, when you're plowing, when you're harvesting, even during the festival seasons, you're going to honor me. You're going to have to trust me. So during the festivals, you don't have to worry about traveling to be in my presence. I'll take care of your farm for you. Nobody else will come steal it. On the Sabbath day, you're going to be tempted to get up that day and go plow. Don't do it. You're going to be tempted to get up that day and go harvest. Don't do it. You know, in our urban setting, it can be a little easier to observe days off, so to speak, because your business may be closed. But if you're a farmer and all you do every day is work your own farm, well, it never closes. It just doesn't happen. And nobody else is going out there to do it for you. You're the one that's responsible for it. And so what the Lord is saying, get your work done 6 days a week, give me that 7th day, and trust me that you can get more done in 6 days with my help than you can do in 7 days without my help. So, my first 2 churches were country churches. I was in Jimtown, Oklahoma, where Cindy and I started. That church was full of peanut farmers. They have that, it's right on, y'all know where Jimtown is, right? If you go on 35 and get off at Marietta and turn west and go 13 miles and then turn south and go 6 miles and stop, you're in downtown Jimtown. And the reason you know that is because there's a post there that has about 8 mailboxes attached to it, and that's where the church was located. So, and it was named Jimtown because there were 5 men named Jim who settled that town who were farmers, so they just called it Jimtown. And it's kind of fascinating because every year during the flood season, the Red River would change its course, and sometimes land would come back to Texas, and then the next year it'd go back to Oklahoma. And so you can imagine the conversations we had in church about that, with me living in Texas and all them being Oklahomans, getting their land back from Texans, and there's a whole lot of interesting relationships right there on that little river. But those men, one of the challenges for them was to not plow and harvest on Sunday. because every day that was just their life, it was their job. And so we used to talk about that. And many of them took this right here to heart. They felt like they were supposed to give one day back to the Lord. And so some of them were really hard and fast about that, but they had a very practical approach to life because the Lord was a part of everything they did. I loved that about them. I think I've told you this before. The single most practical prayer I've ever heard prayed in church was at that church. Because peanut farmers, if you know anything about peanuts, they grow underground. But to harvest them, you've got to bring them on top of the ground. They call that digging the peanuts. And so they have these inverters where they go through a field and they'll invert the peanuts. Happens about this time of year, actually, a little bit later. The problem is the peanuts, once they are now on top of the ground, they have moisture in them. And if it freezes, well, that moisture freezes and it ruins the entire crop. So it threatens their livelihood. And so what you pray for is when the peanuts are inverted, that there just won't be any frosts until they can actually get the peanuts harvested. Well, one year, second year we were the pastor there, they had dug those peanuts, they call it digging those peanuts, and a really bad frost was predicted to hit on Monday morning. And so Sunday night at church, I asked Paul Hallam to stand up and pray, and he ran the business that kind of helped all of them get all their peanuts done. And I'll never forget, he stood up to pray, and he said, "Now, Lord, you know good and well we already dug those peanuts. Last thing we need in the morning is a killing frost." He said, "So if you could just hold off, all these boys here, we've all agreed we'll help each other get our peanuts in the barn. So if you could just hold off on the frost, we'd really appreciate it. Amen." And I thought, now that right there is a practical prayer. I'll never forget how he started that out. You know good and well we already dug those peanuts. And you know what's funny, y'all? It didn't freeze. And those boys got all those peanuts in. Well, then I moved to Mertens, and they're all cotton farmers. Very different group of people. It's funny how farmers that grow different crops have different personas. I'm not sure how to put it. Different ethos. But they had the same temptation. What do you do on Sunday? How do you honor the Lord with your faith and your belief in what God is providing for you? Well, the Jews start off knowing when they get to the Promised Land, they're going to all pretty much be agrarian people. And so the Lord is saying, regardless of what you do, I'm telling you, you honor me on the Sabbath, and then you do your work the rest of the week. So, and he puts some pretty serious restrictions around it. I mean, when the Lord says things like, "Don't do this or you will die," well, that's usually a pretty good sign that he's taking this very seriously. Then you have kind of an interesting story that's told about Moses and God. Now, at this point in the story, Moses' leadership is a little bit in question. He's gone up on the mountain, and when he comes back, the people have strayed and sacrificed, to a golden young bull and had all these celebrations. And remember, they said, "Where is that guy? That guy that brought us out, we don't know where he is." And so Moses' position right now is a little bit suspect. So it's interesting what happens. If you look at verse 27 of chapter 34, the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words, I've made a covenant with you and with Israel." Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets, the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So God is restoring Moses, is what's happening, I believe, as the undisputed leader of his people. So he's able to receive and record the covenant. And I believe that the antecedent of he at the end of that verse is God. And most scholars take it that way, that God actually wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant. And remember, there were 2 copies of them, one for the Lord, one for the people. That was very common in the ancient world to always have 2 copies of a covenant. But then you have this really interesting take on Moses. Look at verse 29. When Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with those 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant. They were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he'd put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. And then Moses would put the veil back over his face till he went in to speak with the Lord. So here's this really interesting relationship between God and Moses. And I think what's happening is that God is establishing officially at this point in their history that Moses is his chosen leader. And because of how Moses looked, it was obvious he had been with God. Now here's what's fascinating about how this is worded. If you look at verse 29, it says that he was not aware. No, in other words, Moses didn't even know that this had changed his appearance. He'd just been with God. And kind of speaks to the humility of Moses. And then in Hebrew, it's interesting how it's worded in Hebrew in verse 2. He was not aware that the skin of his face is kind of literally what it says. And then it says something was emerging from the skin of his face, like rays, if you will. Now, the NIV just kind of takes all of that and puts it like this. He was just radiant. But when you look at other translations, it's a little hard to figure out exactly what Moses is saying here. And one of the challenges is the word that's used there for the rays that are emerging from Moses' face is the same root for the Hebrew word horn. And so if you'll fast forward to about 300 or so, or 400 or so AD, and Jerome is translating the Bible into Latin. When Jerome came to this text in his study of Hebrew, he went with horn rather than rays. R-A-Y, in other words, rays kind of emitting off of Moses' face and head. Jerome used the word horn, which is the root word here in Hebrew. Now, while that's an interesting thing, we have to explain this every year when we go to Rome, because every time Moses is depicted in Renaissance art, he has horns on his head. And it's fascinating, when some people see that, they think, well, is Michelangelo depicting Moses as a demon? No, he's trying to show you that Moses' face is radiant. And he's using the Vulgate to guide him, because Michelangelo read the Bible in Latin. And in this text in Latin, it says horns were emerging from Moses. And so that's why whenever you look at Moses depicted in art, particularly in the Renaissance era, he always has horns, and it's symbolic of the glory of God. And so it's kind of a little interesting take on how to translate that word. But the point also that's being made is none of these people had ever seen someone stand in front of an idol and walk away with a radiant glow. Okay, that just never happened. But every time Moses was with God, that's what happened. And so what also is being communicated here is there's nobody like God. So, and I would just say, it's one of my favorite passages because of how Paul interprets it. So if I can, let me just read to y'all. If you were to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul takes this story and everything that's going on in it and uses it to help me and you understand what's supposed to be happening in our lives. So if you go to 2 Corinthians 3, verse 7, Paul says, "Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory." So in other words, when God gave the law to Israel, he appeared in all his glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was. Will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. He's comparing the law and the gospel. And if what was transitory came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? That's the glory of the gospel. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we're very bold. We're not like Moses, who had put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. So there's Paul's interpretation. That was the historic rabbinic interpretation of this experience in Moses' life, that sometimes Moses would wear a veil so you didn't know whether he was glowing or not. Okay? So Paul takes that to say Moses would cover his face when he knew he wasn't glowing. Now the Hebrew doesn't say that, but that's Paul's interpretation. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It's not been removed because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. Now this is a mature Paul who struggled with the Jews who won't listen to his preaching. Verse 16, but whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, the Lord is spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into His image with an ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So Paul says the longer we're in the presence of the Lord, the more glory is on display in us and is radiating from us because of our relationship with God. So Paul says Moses, when he was with God, the glory was on display, and the longer he was away from God, the glory diminished. He says, now you and I have got the gospel, and the glory never diminishes because the Spirit of God's inside of all of us. So it's a beautiful application and interpretation of what happened to Moses through the gospel lens, if you will. Okay? Now, with that said, then Moses turns his attention to, let's get this tabernacle built. He reminds them again in chapter 35, the first 3 verses about the Sabbath. But now it's time to build. The covenant's been restored. The people of God are ready. God is ready. Moses is ready. And he wants everybody to be a part of it. It is time to build. So God's people are invited to be a part of it. Every piece of it. Okay? And there are going to be ways they can do it. He's going to invite his people to express their gratitude to him through their acts of generosity. He's going to bless them with skills necessary to accomplish what's got to happen. Remember, as we talked about this, when these people were in Egypt, evidently they learned all kinds of skills. They worked in all kinds of jobs in Egypt. So now it's time to build the tabernacle. So if you look at chapter 35, look at verse 3. He says, from what you have, take an offering for the Lord, everyone who is willing. There's the generosity. Everybody that's willing, we want you to give. Okay? And look at verse 10. All of you who are skilled, you're to come and help make the tabernacle a reality. There's the skills. So it's both generosity and skills. So look at verse 21. Everyone who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work of the tent of meeting, for all its service, its sacred garments. Verse 22. All who were willing, men and women alike. In other words, this is for everybody, and they brought everything: jewelry, brooches, earrings, rings, ornaments, gold. We're not really sure, to be honest with y'all, what a wave offering was. It's a little challenging. Notice everybody gives pretty much anything that can be used. Verse 28. They also brought spices, olive oil. Verse 29. All the men and women who were willing. There's the generosity. Look at verse 30. Remember that God had chosen Bezalel, verse 31, filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, knowledge, and all kinds of skills. Verse 35, he's filled them with skills to do all kinds of work. Chapter 36, verse 1, Bezalel, Aholiab, and every skilled person whom the Lord has given skill and ability to know how to carry out the work are going to do what God has commanded them. So God asked them for the materials, generosity. He asked them for their participation, their skills. Put all that together, and they're going to build the tabernacle. Now, the most interesting thing happened, though, in this first building campaign. Okay? If you look at verse 5 of chapter 36, or verse 4 rather, the skilled workers were doing all the work on the sanctuary. They left what they were doing, and they told Moses, the people are bringing more than enough for doing the work the Lord commanded to be done. Then Moses gave an order and sent this word throughout the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. And so the people were restrained from bringing more because they already had more than enough to do the work. So they were so generous, Moses had to say, the building campaign is over. Quit giving. Okay? Fascinating, right? Quit giving. We have enough. But it just shows you the generosity of the people. And it's interesting, though, Derek Kidner is one of my favorite commentators. He's written a commentary on Exodus and one on Genesis, and there's several other folks that write on these texts. But one of the commentators I read said, in his mind, he was imagining that some people delayed giving, and then when they decided they were ready to give, it was too late and they didn't get to give. And his take was, don't delay. God impresses you to give, go ahead and give. I'd never thought about that. I thought it was kind of interesting. So what a story. These people are going to take their skills, everything they've learned. Now they're going to give their goods. And y'all think about it. Everything they had at this point in history, everything they had came from who? The Egyptians. So God had given it to them, right? And so when God says, I want you to bring some of it back, it would have been a hard argument to get. Now, wait a minute. It'd been hard to argue, right? Wait a minute, Lord, what do you mean you want some of this? Well, come on, y'all. Everything you have didn't come from the Egyptians, but it came from God, right? Everything. Everything we all have, right? God gave us the ability to do it. He gave us the brains, the wherewithal. Everything we have is the Lord's. And so you and I have to adopt that same humble posture. You know, if you think about it, God could ask for all of it, couldn't he? He could have reversed the tithe. He could have said, okay, here's what I want you to have and use. Now give me 90% of that. And you keep 10%. Right? He could have done it that way. But that's not what he did. When he's challenging Israel to understand how to be gracious, he said, well, just give me 10% of it. Well, how gracious of God to let us keep 90%, you know? So the thing is, it's all his in the first place. And the Jews responded. And I love how Moses had to do something that no pastor I've ever met has ever done, and that is tell people to quit giving to something. I don't know that that's ever happened. Some of you former pastors in the room, I don't know if you've ever heard that happen or not. But I love the principle there. The need was put in front of the people to both do the work and give to it, and they did it. And that's what I would tell y'all in my lifetime as a pastor, and even before I started pastoring. My experience with the people of God in general is that they are pretty generous people, and they want to participate in things that matter. And so you've got a group of people here who've spent their lives as slaves building everything for the Egyptians. Everything their hand has ever touched was built for the Egyptians. And now for the first time in their life, they're going to get the chance to build something for their God. No wonder they were so eager to do it. First time ever. Everything they had ever had been given to them by the Egyptians. And now finally God has blessed them and they can give something back to him. What a great time for them. What a privilege it was. So it's no wonder they were lining up. That's how I read it. They're lining up. In fact, the workers, the way it's worded in the early part of chapter 36, the workers have to come off the work because the people keep bringing so much. And they just said, hold on one second, let's go tell Moses. Moses, tell these people to quit bringing everything. You know, we've got enough. It says something about the zeal in the hearts of these people at this point in time. And it's an incredible example, encouragement to me for us to maintain that posture as the people of God today. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you joining us online, thank you. And we will see you next Wednesday.